The ancient stones of the Tower of London gleamed wet with morning dew as crowds of international tourists gathered beneath the fortress walls that had stood sentinel over the Thames for nearly 1,000 years. The October morning carried a crisp bite in the air, and wisps of fog drifted lazily across the cobblestones where countless historical figures had walked their final steps toward execution or imprisonment. Among the diverse group of visitors stood Marcus Thompson, a 4 to 5-year-old oil executive from Houston, Texas, whose presence seemed to command attention wherever he went. His custom-tailored charcoal suit probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. And the gleaming Rolex Presidential on his wrist caught the pale morning sunlight with every gesture. Marcus had arrived in London 3 days earlier for a high-stakes business merger worth several $100 million. But his British partners had insisted he experience some of the city's famous historical attractions during his stay. Marcus found the entire suggestion ridiculous. In his mind, history was something that slowed down progress and kept people focused on the past instead of building the future. He had built his fortune in Texas oil by tearing down old structures and drilling new wells. By replacing outdated systems with cutting-edge technology. The idea of spending his valuable time looking at crumbling medieval buildings felt like a complete waste of resources. Standing near the entrance to the Crown Jewels exhibition, dressed in the iconic red and gold uniform of the Yeoman Warders, was William Davies. At 50 years old, William had dedicated the past 15 years of his life to serving as one of the tower's famous Beefeater Guards. Following a distinguished military career that had taken him from the Falklands to Northern Ireland to Afghanistan, his weathered face bore the quiet dignity that came from decades of service to crown and country. And his encyclopedic knowledge of the tower's 1,000-year history was matched only by his genuine passion for sharing those stories with visitors. From around the world, William took immense pride in his role as a guardian of British heritage. Every morning, he put on his ceremonial uniform with the same reverence that a priest might don his robes, understanding that he was not just wearing clothing, but carrying the weight of centuries of tradition and sacrifice. The Tower of London wasn't just his workplace. It was a sacred trust that connected him to every generation of men and women who had served within these walls. The morning tour group was typically diverse, representing a cross-section of international visitors who had traveled thousands of miles to experience one of the world's most famous historical sites. There was an elderly Japanese couple who had saved for years to visit Europe, their careful notes and respectful questions showing their deep appreciation for cultural learning. A young German family with 2 well-behaved children listened attentively, as their parents explained the importance of understanding history from all perspectives. Several British families had brought their own children to learn about their heritage, while a group of Australian university students on their gap-year adventure showed genuine enthusiasm for the stories they were about to hear. Marcus checked his phone for the 15th time in 10 minutes, his impatience growing with each passing moment. The merger negotiations were entering their final phase, and he had 3 conference calls scheduled for later that afternoon with investors back in Houston. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from his assistant, updates from his legal team, and market reports that could affect the deal's valuation. Every minute spent listening to stories about dead kings and executed queens felt like money slipping away from his already substantial fortune. William began his presentation with the same dignified enthusiasm he brought to every tour, his voice carrying clearly across the gathered crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Her Majesty's Royal Palace and Fortress, the Tower of London. For nearly 1,000 years, this remarkable fortress has served as a royal palace, a secure prison, an execution site, and the home of the crown jewels. The stones beneath your feet have witnessed the rise and fall of kingdoms, the triumph and tragedy of countless human stories, and the preservation of traditions that connect us to our shared past. His words were carefully chosen to help visitors understand that they were not simply looking at old buildings, but standing in a place where history had been made by real people facing real challenges. William had perfected his introduction over years of practice, knowing exactly how to capture the imagination of diverse audiences while respecting the solemnity of the site's darker moments. Marcus rolled his eyes dramatically and shifted his weight from foot to foot, making no effort to hide his boredom and irritation. The other tourists began to notice his obvious discomfort and lack of respect, with several parents quietly moving their children away from his negative energy. His expensive leather shoes clicked impatiently against the ancient cobblestones, creating an annoying rhythm that disrupted the respectful atmosphere William was trying to establish. The contrast between Marcus's modern materialism and the tower's ancient dignity created an uncomfortable tension that seemed to hang in the morning air like the lingering fog from the Thames. While other visitors pulled out cameras to respectfully document their experience, Marcus was already calculating how quickly he could complete this obligation and return to his hotel suite for more important business calls. William noticed Marcus's disruptive behavior but continued his presentation with the professional composure that came from years of dealing with difficult visitors. He had encountered every type of tourist imaginable during his tenure as a yeoman warder, from genuinely interested history enthusiasts to completely disengaged travelers who were only there because someone else had insisted. However, something about Marcus's particular brand of arrogant dismissal struck him as more troubling than usual casual disinterest. As the group began to move toward their first historical stop, Marcus pulled out his phone, once again speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear about million-dollar deals and market fluctuations, completely oblivious to how his behavior was affecting the experience of dozens of other people who had come to learn about one of the world's most significant historical sites. As William led the group of 30 tourists through the tower's ancient gateways toward the infamous Tower Green, Marcus's disruptive behavior escalated from mere rudeness to outright contempt for everything around him. The morning sun had burned away most of the fog, revealing the full majesty of the medieval architecture that had survived wars, fires, bombings, and nearly a millennium of London's turbulent history. While other visitors gazed in wonder at the massive stone walls and Norman towers, Marcus saw only obstacles to modern development and symbols of backward thinking. "This is absolutely ridiculous," Marcus announced loudly, interrupting William's carefully prepared explanation about the tower's role during the Wars of the Roses. Why should anyone in the 21st century care about some ancient family feud between people who died 500 years ago? These stories have absolutely nothing to do with the real world where actual progress happens. The Japanese couple exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly embarrassed by the Americans' behavior. They had spent months planning their European vacation, studying guidebooks, and learning about British history so they could fully appreciate the cultural significance of sites like the Tower of London. The elderly husband quietly translated Marcus's comments for his wife, whose shocked expression showed her disbelief that anyone could be so disrespectful in such a sacred historical place. Marcus continued his tirade, emboldened by what he mistakenly interpreted as the tour guide's polite silence. Look at this place, objectively. Crumbling old stones, outdated security systems, and tour guides dressed up like circus performers telling fairy tales about dead royalty. In America, specifically in Texas where I come from, we understand that progress means replacing old, inefficient structures with modern, profitable developments. William paused his historical narrative, his experienced eyes taking in the situation with the calm professionalism that came from 15 years of dealing with every conceivable type of difficult visitor. He had encountered drunk tourists, disrespectful teenagers, and even the occasional mentally unstable individual. But Marcus represented a different category of challenge entirely. This wasn't ignorance or youth or temporary poor judgment. This was deliberate, calculated disrespect for the sacrifices and struggles of countless generations. Take this whole tower complex, for example. Marcus gestured broadly with his expensive smartphone, using it as a pointer while simultaneously checking his stock portfolio. This entire area could be demolished and turned into a luxury hotel and shopping complex that would actually contribute to London's economy instead of just draining tourist dollars with these ridiculous costume parties and ghost stories. The young German family that had been listening so attentively moved their 2 children further away from Marcus, with the mother whispering urgently in her husband's ear. Their 8-year-old daughter had been fascinated by the stories of medieval life. But now she looked confused and upset by the angry American man who seemed to hate everything they found interesting. The father put a protective arm around his family, clearly weighing whether to remove his children from the tour entirely. Several British families in the group showed visible signs of offense and anger at Marcus's comments. An elderly man wearing a Royal Navy veteran's pin on his jacket stepped closer to his wife, his weathered hands clenching into fists as Marcus continued his assault on their national heritage. A middle-aged woman from Manchester muttered something under her breath about ignorant Americans, while her teenage daughter recorded Marcus's behavior on her phone, apparently planning to share his rudeness with her social media followers. Marcus pulled out his phone again and began taking selfies with exaggerated expressions of boredom and disgust, posing in front of the medieval architecture with theatrical yawns and eye rolls. "Wait until my business partners back in Houston see this." He laughed loudly, completely oblivious to the growing hostility of the crowd around him. "They'll get a real kick out of these primitive British tourist traps. No wonder America had to come over here and save you people during World War II." The mention of World War II caused an immediate and noticeable shift in the atmosphere surrounding the tour group. Several elderly visitors who might have lived through the war years looked genuinely shocked and hurt by Marcus's casual dismissal of one of Britain's finest hours. The Australian university students, who had been chatting quietly among themselves, fell silent and turned their attention toward the unfolding confrontation. William's grip on his ceremonial staff tightened almost imperceptibly. Expression remained perfectly controlled and professional. What Marcus couldn't possibly know was that his flippant comment about World War II had touched on something deeply personal for the yeoman warder. Something that connected directly to his own family's history and his reasons for dedicating his life to preserving British heritage. "You know what your real problem is over here?" Marcus continued, warming to his theme as he scrolled through his phone's camera roll, apparently preparing to share his mocking photos immediately. "You're all living in the past instead of focusing on the future. In America, we tear down old buildings that have outlived their usefulness and build something modern and efficient in their place. That's why we became the world's dominant superpower. While you guys were still playing dress-up and telling stories about kings and queens, a group of French tourists who had been taking respectful photographs of the tower's architecture stopped, their picture-taking entirely, staring in disbelief at Marcus's performance. One of them, a well-dressed woman in her 50s, whispered something to her companions in rapid French, her tone clearly expressing disgust at the American's behavior. The young British mother with 2 small children had moved her family to the very edge of the tour group, trying to shield her 5- and 7-year-old from Marcus's increasingly aggressive commentary. Her children had been excited to learn about their country's history, but now they looked frightened and confused by the angry man who seemed to hate everything their parents had taught them to respect and value. Marcus seemed to feed off the negative energy he was creating, interpreting the shocked silence of his fellow tourists as validation of his superior worldview. He had no understanding that his behavior was not just rude or inappropriate, but was actually causing genuine pain and offense to people who had deep emotional connections to the history and traditions he was so casually dismissing. William continued to lead the group toward their next historical stop, but everyone could sense that something significant was building beneath his calm, professional exterior. The morning that had begun with such promise for cultural learning and shared appreciation was rapidly deteriorating into an uncomfortable confrontation between American arrogance and British dignity. William Davies stood motionless for several long moments, his weathered hands gripping his ceremonial staff as Marcus's comments about World War II echoed across the ancient courtyard. The other tourists watched nervously, sensing that something profound was happening beneath the yeoman warder's carefully maintained professional composure. What none of them could possibly understand was the deeply personal connection that Marcus's flippant words had triggered in William's mind and heart. The mention of America saving Britain during World War II had struck William like a physical blow. It's not because of wounded national pride, but because of memories that stretched back to his earliest childhood and the most formative relationships of his life. hidden beneath his red and gold uniform. William carried scars that went far deeper than anything visible on his weathered face. Scars that connected him directly to one of the most heroic and tragic chapters in British military history. William's grandfather, Flight Lieutenant Robert Davies, had been just 19 years old when he first climbed into the cockpit of a Supermarine Spitfire. During the summer of 1940, the Battle of Britain was raging across the skies over southern England, and every day brought desperate aerial combat as outnumbered RAF pilots fought to prevent German invasion. Robert was one of the few, the legendary fighter pilots whom Winston Churchill credited with saving British civilization during its darkest hour. Young Robert Davies flew 37 combat missions during those crucial months when Britain stood completely alone against Nazi Germany. Every morning, he kissed a small photograph of his sweetheart, Margaret, and climbed into his aircraft knowing there was approximately a 50% chance he would not return alive. The mathematics of survival were brutally simple. German bombers came every day, and British pilots went up to stop them. And many never came back down. On September 15th, 1940, during what historians would later call the hardest day, Robert's Spitfire was hit by cannon fire from a German Messerschmitt fighter over the Thames estuary. His engine caught fire, his controls were damaged, and he was forced to attempt a crash landing in a field just outside London. The impact broke both his legs, shattered his left arm, and left him unconscious with serious head injuries. Robert spent the next 3 months in a London hospital, recovering from his injuries while German bombs fell around the building every night during the Blitz. He listened to the sounds of air raid sirens, anti-aircraft guns, and exploding bombs, while lying helpless in his hospital bed, knowing that his fellow pilots were still fighting the battle he could no longer join. The psychological trauma of being grounded while his squadron continued to face death daily would haunt him for the rest of his life. When Robert finally returned to active duty in early 1941, he was assigned to a different role, training new pilots who were barely 18 years old and desperately needed to learn combat skills before being thrown into the aerial battle for Britain's survival. He watched dozens of young men learn to fly, knowing that many of them would be dead within weeks of completing their training. The responsibility of preparing teenagers for almost certain death weighed heavily on his conscience. In June 1941, Robert volunteered for a dangerous reconnaissance mission over occupied France, hoping to prove to himself that he could still face combat after his injuries. His aircraft was shot down by German anti-aircraft fire, and he was captured after 3 days of hiding in French farmland. He spent the next 3 years as a prisoner of war in Stellach, Luft 3, the infamous German prison camp that would later become famous for the Great Escape. The conditions in the prison camp were deliberately harsh, designed to break the spirit of captured Allied airmen. Robert endured starvation rations, brutal cold during winter months, constant psychological pressure from German guards, and the devastating news that many of his squadron mates had been killed while he was imprisoned. He organized secret resistance activities among the prisoners, helping to dig escape tunnels and maintain morale among men who had little hope of seeing home again. When the camp was finally liberated by advancing Allied forces in 1945, Robert weighed less than 90 pounds and had lost most of his teeth to malnutrition and scurvy. The psychological scars were even more severe than his physical condition. He had nightmares for decades afterward, waking up screaming about burning aircraft and dead friends who visited him in his dreams. Robert returned to England as a decorated war hero. But he never felt comfortable with that label. In his mind, the real heroes were the men who had died in combat, particularly those who had fallen during the crucial early months of the war, when Britain's survival hung in the balance. He married his sweetheart Margaret and tried to build a normal life, but the war had changed him in ways that could never be fully healed. Throughout William's childhood, his grandfather had been a quiet, dignified man who rarely spoke about his wartime experiences unless directly asked. But on special occasions, particularly during visits to historical sites like the Tower of London, Robert would open up about those dangerous years and the lessons they had taught him about courage, sacrifice, and the price of freedom. William. His grandfather had said during one memorable visit to these very stone walls. This old fortress has stood for 1,000 years not because of its stones and mortar, but because of the people in every generation who believed it was worth defending. Every generation faces that same choice: to preserve what matters or to let it crumble away through neglect or indifference. Those words had shaped William's entire life philosophy and his decision to dedicate his career to preserving British history and heritage. As Marcus Thompson stood just a few feet away, dismissing the sacrifices of Robert Davies and millions like him, William felt his grandfather's presence as strongly as if the old pilot were standing right beside him. In the Tower courtyard, the transformation in William Davies was subtle but unmistakable to anyone who knew how to read the signs of a veteran processing difficult emotions. His breathing became deeper and more controlled, his posture straightened with military precision, and his eyes took on the focused intensity that had once served him well during his own combat deployments in Afghanistan and Iraq. The other tourists sensed the change in atmosphere, though most couldn't quite identify what had shifted in their dignified tour guide. Marcus, completely oblivious to the profound impact of his words, continued scrolling through his phone while making additional disparaging comments about British culture and history. He seemed to interpret the sudden silence from the group as validation of his superior worldview, not recognizing that he had just insulted the memory of thousands of young men who had died defending the very freedom that allowed him to speak. So carelessly, William made a decision that would surprise everyone present, including himself. Instead of the sharp military reprimand that Marcus's behavior clearly deserved, or the cold professional dismissal that would have been entirely justified, William chose a different approach. He walked slowly and deliberately toward the arrogant American businessman, his ceremonial uniform rustling softly in the morning breeze, his expression revealing genuine curiosity rather than anger or contempt. "Sir William," said quietly, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to command, but without any trace of hostility or aggression. "I find myself genuinely curious about something you mentioned. You stated that America saved Britain during World War II. I'm wondering if you could elaborate on that perspective for the benefit of our international visitors." The entire tour group turned their attention toward this unexpected development, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. The Japanese couple moved closer, their eyes bright with anticipation of a teachable moment. The German family gathered their children protectively, uncertain whether they were about to witness an argument or an educational opportunity. Even the Australian university students put away their phones and notebooks, recognizing that they might be about to learn something important that wouldn't be found in any guidebook. Marcus's face immediately lit up with satisfaction and vindication, believing he had finally found someone willing to acknowledge American superiority and British dependence. His chest puffed out with pride as he prepared to deliver what he clearly expected would be a crushing blow to British historical mythology. "Well, obviously," Marcus said loudly, gesturing dramatically with his expensive smartphone, "Britain was getting absolutely crushed by the German military machine until America decided to enter the war and save the day. Without American industrial might, American technology, and American fighting men, you would all be speaking German right now and goose-stepping around these medieval ruins." William nodded thoughtfully, as if genuinely considering this interpretation of historical events with the open-minded curiosity of a scholar rather than the defensive reaction of a patriot whose national honor had been challenged. His calm demeanor seemed to encourage Marcus to elaborate further on his understanding of World War II history. "The simple fact is," Marcus continued with growing confidence, "Britain was a small, outdated island nation that couldn't compete with modern German efficiency and military technology. Hitler would have invaded and conquered this entire country if America hadn't stepped in to do the heavy lifting. It's just historical fact, regardless of whatever romantic stories you tell tourists about British heroism. That's a fascinating perspective," William replied with what appeared to be genuine interest, though several members of the tour group were beginning to recognize something deeper happening beneath his polite exterior. "I wonder if you could help me understand the timeline of events you're describing," Specifically, what do you know about the period between September 1940 and December 1941? Marcus looked momentarily confused by the specific dates, his confident expression flickering slightly as he tried to process the significance of William's question. "I don't memorize random numbers and dates," he said dismissively, waving his hand as if such details were beneath his consideration. "The important point is that America won the war for everyone else who was too weak or too scared to fight effectively." "Dates aren't random at all," William explained with the patience of an experienced teacher, addressing a student who had missed some crucial information. September 1940 was when the German Luftwaffe began their sustained bombing campaign against British cities. Attempting to break our civilian morale and force our government to surrender, December 1941 was when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and America entered the war. The tour group had moved closer, forming a rough circle around William and Marcus as they sensed that this conversation was developing into something much more significant than a simple disagreement about historical facts. Even the children seemed to understand that they were witnessing an important moment. Though they might not fully comprehend the deeper implications of what was being discussed, those 15 months, William continued in his measured professional tone, represent the period when Britain stood completely alone against Nazi Germany. 15 months when German bombers attacked London and other British cities every single night, trying to terrorize our civilian population into submission. 15 months when young British pilots, many of them still teenagers, now climbed into aircraft every morning knowing they had approximately a 50% chance of surviving. Until evening, Marcus shifted uncomfortably, his earlier confidence beginning to waver as William's calm recitation of historical facts challenged his oversimplified understanding of wartime chronology. The other tourists watched in fascination as their tours guide transformed from a ceremonial figure into an educator delivering what was clearly becoming a master class in World War II history. "During those 15 months of standing alone," William said, his voice remaining steady but gaining emotional depth, "Britain faced the very real possibility of invasion and conquest. German forces were massed just 22 miles away across the English Channel, waiting for the Luftwaffe to gain air superiority so they could launch Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of our island." The elderly British veteran in the group nodded knowingly, remembering his own father's stories about those dark days when every morning brought uncertainty about whether Britain would survive another day of bombardment and whether invasion forces would appear on the horizon. William's voice took on a deeper resonance as he continued his impromptu history lesson, drawing from decades of research, personal family stories, and his own military experience to paint a vivid picture of Britain's finest and darkest hour. The morning sun had climbed higher, casting sharp shadows across the tower's ancient courtyard. But nobody in the tour group seemed aware of anything except the quiet drama unfolding between the dignified yeoman warder and the increasingly uncomfortable American businessman. "My grandfather, Flight Lieutenant Robert Davies, was 19 years old when he first flew combat missions during the Battle of Britain," William said, his words carrying the weight of personal testimony rather than abstract historical recitation. He belonged to a generation of young men who woke up every morning knowing that they were quite literally all that stood between Hitler's war machine and the complete destruction of everything we held dear. Marcus's face had lost much of its earlier arrogance, replaced by growing discomfort as he began to realize that his casual dismissal of British wartime heroism had touched something deeply personal in the man standing before him. In the tour group's dynamic was equally remarkable, as visitors who had seemed ready to abandon the tour entirely now pressed closer to hear every word of William's response. The mathematics of survival during those desperate months were brutally simple, William continued, his military bearing becoming more pronounced as he drew upon his own combat experience to help explain the psychological reality of aerial warfare. German bombers came over London and other British cities every single day. British pilots went up to stop them. Many of those pilots never came back down. The Japanese couple listened with rapt attention, the elderly husband translating quietly for his wife, while both of them recognized that they were witnessing something far more valuable than any standard tourist presentation. Their own country's wartime history had taught them to appreciate the complexity of courage and sacrifice during global conflict, and they understood the profound respect that William was showing for those who had served and died. When my grandfather's Spitfire was shot down over the Thames in September 1940, William said, his voice maintaining its steady cadence despite the emotional weight of the story. He spent 3 months in a London hospital while German bombs fell around the building. Every night. He told me that lying in that hospital bed, listening to air raid sirens and explosions, was harder than flying combat missions because he felt helpless while his friends continued fighting the battle he could no longer join. The young, German family had moved their children closer to the center of the group. Recognizing that this unexpected lesson in World War II history was something their sons and daughter needed to hear, the father whispered translations in their native language, helping his children understand the significance of what they were witnessing while maintaining appropriate respect for the gravity of the subject matter. After he recovered from his injuries, William continued, my grandfather returned to duty training new pilots, most of whom were barely 18 years old. He taught them everything he could about aerial combat, knowing that many of them would be dead within weeks of completing their training. The psychological burden of preparing teenagers for almost certain death haunted him for the rest of his life. Several members of the tour group were visibly moved by William's account, particularly the elderly British visitors, who remembered their own family members' wartime experiences. The woman from Manchester had tears in her eyes as she thought about her own father's service in the Royal Navy, while the veteran wearing the Navy pin stood at respectful attention, recognizing a fellow serviceman's tribute to fallen comrades. June 1941, still 5 months before America entered the war, William emphasized, his eyes never leaving Marcus's increasingly pale face. My grandfather volunteered for a reconnaissance mission over occupied France. His aircraft was shot down by German anti-aircraft fire, and he spent the next 3 years as a prisoner of war in Stalag Luft III. Marcus had completely stopped fidgeting with his phone, his earlier arrogance replaced by something approaching genuine shame as he began to comprehend the personal cost of the history he had so carelessly dismissed. The other tourists watched his transformation with a mixture of sympathy and satisfaction, recognizing that his moment of education was also serving as a form of justice for his earlier disrespectful behavior. The conditions in the German prison camp were deliberately designed to break the spirit of captured Allied airmen. His professional knowledge of military history combining with his grandfather's personal accounts to create a vivid picture of wartime suffering, starvation, rations, brutal cold, constant psychological pressure, and the devastating news that friends and squadron mates were dying while the prisoners remained helpless behind barbed wire. The Australian university students had pulled out notebooks and were taking careful notes, recognizing that they were receiving a history education far more valuable than anything they could find in textbooks or classrooms. Their gap year adventure was providing them with first-hand exposure to the kind of personal testimony that brings historical events to life in ways that academic study alone cannot achieve. When the camp was finally liberated by advancing Allied forces in 1945, William said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, forcing everyone to lean closer to hear his words, my grandfather weighed less than 90 pounds and had lost most of his teeth to malnutrition and scurvy. But the physical damage was nothing compared to the psychological scars that would haunt him for decades afterward. The emotional impact of William's story had created a profound silence across the entire tour group, with even the young children seeming to understand that they were hearing something important about courage, sacrifice, and the true cost of freedom. Marcus stood frozen in place, his expensive suit and gold watch suddenly seeming meaningless against the quiet dignity of the man whose family history he had unknowingly insulted. My grandfather lived with nightmares for the rest of his life, William concluded, his eyes finally moving away from Marcus to address the entire group. He would wake up screaming about burning aircraft and dead friends who visited him in his dreams, but he never considered himself a hero. In his mind, the real heroes were the ones who didn't come home, particularly those who died during those crucial 15 months when Britain stood alone against fascism. The silence that followed William's conclusion seemed to stretch across centuries, connecting the present moment to all the ghosts that haunted the Tower of London's ancient stones. Marcus Thompson stood completely motionless, his face pale and his earlier arrogance replaced by something that looked very much like genuine shame. For perhaps the first time in his adult life, his wealth, his business success, and his American confidence seemed utterly inadequate in the face of real courage and sacrifice. William allowed the silence to continue. For several long moments, letting his grandfather's story settle into the hearts and minds of everyone present. Then, with the same quiet dignity that had marked his entire presentation, he continued with what would become the most profound lesson any of them would ever receive about the true meaning of heroism and heritage. "You asked earlier why anyone should care about people who died hundreds of years ago," William said, his voice now addressing Marcus directly, but speaking loudly enough for the entire group to hear. "You wondered why we preserve these old stones and tell these ancient stories when we could be focusing on modern progress and future prosperity." The Japanese couple moved even closer, recognizing that they were about to witness the climax of something extraordinary. Their years of studying different cultures had taught them to appreciate moments when deep wisdom was being shared across generational and cultural boundaries. And they sensed that William's response would be something they would remember for the rest of their lives. "My grandfather used to bring me here when I was a boy," William continued, gesturing toward the ancient walls that surrounded them. "He would stand in this very courtyard and tell me that these stones had witnessed 1,000 years of people making the same fundamental choice that he and his generation had made during World War II, to stand up for something bigger than themselves, even when it seemed hopeless." Marcus opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came. The casual dismissal that had carried him through the morning had completely evaporated, replaced by a growing understanding of how profoundly he had misjudged both the man standing before him and the historical significance of everything around him. Anne Boleyn, whom you mentioned earlier, died because she refused to abandon her beliefs even when threatened by the most powerful man in England, William explained, his voice taking on the cadence of a master teacher who had found his rhythm. The medieval soldiers who built these walls, the guards who defended them through sieges and wars, the civilians who survived the Blitz bombings that damaged these very stones in 1941, they all made the same choice. The transformation in Marcus was visible to everyone watching. His expensive suit and gold watch, which had made him feel so superior just an hour earlier, now seemed like costume jewelry compared to the quiet dignity of the man in the ceremonial uniform. For the first time in years, Marcus felt genuinely humble in the presence of someone whose life had been dedicated to something greater than personal profit. "This isn't just about old stones and dead people," William said, his eyes sweeping across the entire group but returning again and again to Marcus's face. "It's about understanding that every generation inherits something precious from those who came before, and every generation must decide whether to preserve it, improve it, or let it disappear through neglect or deliberate destruction." The elderly British veteran in the group stepped forward slightly, his weathered hands showing the same kind of respectful attention that military men give to particularly meaningful ceremonies. "My father served in the Royal Navy during the war," he said, quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "He always told me that the Americans were incredibly brave allies who helped secure the final victory. But he also said that Britain proved something crucial during those months when we stood alone." Marcus felt tears beginning to form in his eyes, though he couldn't quite understand why this stranger's story was affecting him so deeply. His entire worldview, built on American exceptionalism and the superiority of modern capitalism over traditional values, was crumbling under the weight of personal testimony and historical truth. "What did Britain prove?" asked one of the Australian students, her notebook ready to record whatever wisdom was about to be shared. William looked directly at Marcus as he answered, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned the right to speak about courage and sacrifice through his own military service and family history. "We prove that some things are worth defending, even when the odds are impossible. Even when you're outnumbered and outgunned, even when the whole world expects you to surrender." The young German mother translated these words for her children, explaining in age-appropriate terms how the conversation they were witnessing connected to the broader themes of standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. Her 8-year-old daughter looked at Marcus with the innocent curiosity of childhood. Sensing his emotional struggle without fully understanding its source, Marcus finally found his voice, though it came out much quieter and less confident than anyone had heard from him all morning. He began, then stopped, clearly struggling to find words adequate for the magnitude of his realization. I didn't know about your grandfather's service. I had no idea about those 15 months when Britain stood alone. The admission hung in the air like a flag of surrender, and William recognized it as such. But instead of pressing his advantage, or delivering the crushing rebuke that Marcus's earlier behavior had certainly earned, the yeoman warder chose the path of grace and education over humiliation and revenge. Very few Americans do know about that period, William replied gently, his tone shifting from teacher to counselor. It's not taught much in American schools, and there's no shame in not knowing something you were never taught. The shame would be in refusing to learn when the opportunity presents itself. Marcus looked around at the other tourists, expecting to see judgment and condemnation in their eyes, but instead found expressions of sympathy and understanding. The Japanese couple nodded encouragingly, their own cultural appreciation for redemption and personal growth evident in their gentle smiles. The German family looked at him with the kind of compassion that comes from understanding how difficult it can be to confront uncomfortable truths about history and personal behavior. My business partner back in Houston, Marcus said slowly, his voice growing stronger as he found the courage to continue. His grandfather served in the Pacific during the war. I always thought that was just old family stories, not something that connected to the real world. But listening to you talk about your grandfather, I'm beginning to understand that these weren't just stories. These were real people facing impossible choices. William nodded approvingly, recognizing the signs of genuine learning and personal growth that he had witnessed in countless students throughout his military and civilian careers. Every family has these stories, Mr. Thompson. American families, British families, German families, Japanese families. The war touched everyone, and the courage it required wasn't limited to any single nationality or culture. The tour group had naturally formed a tight circle around the two men, creating an intimate classroom atmosphere in the heart of one of the world's most famous historical sites. What had begun as a routine tourist presentation devolved into something far more profound, a moment of genuine human connection, cross-cultural and generational boundaries. Marcus pulled out his phone again, but this time for a completely different purpose than his earlier mocking selfies. With obvious embarrassment, he began deleting the disrespectful photographs he had taken throughout the morning, his thumb swiping across the screen to eliminate every trace of his earlier arrogance and contempt. Would it be possible, Marcus? Asked hesitantly, his voice carrying the humility of someone who had been genuinely humbled by new knowledge. To start this tour over from the beginning, I think I missed some very important information, and I'd like to hear it properly this time. The request drew warm smiles from several members of the group, particularly the elderly visitors who recognized the rare sight of genuine character growth happening in real time. The British veteran stepped forward and extended his hand to Marcus in a gesture of reconciliation and respect. "Son," the old sailor said, his weathered face creased with understanding. "Recognizing when you've been wrong takes more courage than most people ever show. Your grandfather would be proud of the man you're becoming right now." William smiled broadly, the first completely genuine expression of joy he had shown all morning. "Of course, we can start over, Mr. Thompson. That's exactly what we're here for. History isn't just about the past. It's about learning from that past to become better people in the present." As the tour resumed, with Marcus now listening attentively to every word, the other visitors welcomed him into their shared experience of discovery and learning. The children who had been frightened by his earlier anger now looked at him with curiosity and acceptance, while their parents modeled the kind of forgiveness and second chances that represent humanity at its finest. The Japanese couple approached Marcus during a quiet moment and shared their own family stories about the war in the Pacific, creating connections between their grandfather's experiences and his business partner's family history. The German family talked about their ongoing efforts to teach their children about their country's complex wartime legacy, emphasizing the importance of understanding history from multiple perspectives. By the time the tour concluded 3 hours later, Marcus Thompson had been transformed from an arrogant, dismissive tourist into someone who understood that true wealth comes not from bank accounts or business deals, but from connections to something larger than oneself. He had learned that progress doesn't require destroying the past, but rather building upon the foundations that previous generations had sacrificed to create. When the group finally dispersed, Marcus approached William one final time, his expensive business card replaced by a simple handwritten note. "Thank you for teaching me something I should have learned long ago," he wrote. "I promise to honor your grandfather's memory by sharing his story with others who need to hear it." William shook Marcus's hand warmly. Seeing in the American businessman's eyes the same quality that had made his grandfather, countless other veterans proud to serve, the recognition that some things are indeed worth defending, worth preserving, and worth passing on to future generations who will face their own tests of character and courage.